Hello and welcome to What Just Happened. Today I'm joined by our lead Europe analyst Alex Lord and Rear Admiral Chris Parry, famed for his exploits in the Falklands, and we're going to be looking at the threat to our critical national infrastructure, particularly our undersea cables. Alex, you recently edited a report which noted a 30% uptick in Russian naval activity. That's pretty significant, isn't it?
Absolutely, Marco. So the report really is an overview of Russian deep sea capabilities, both conventional naval capabilities, but also increasingly, as we are predicting and increasingly seeing, the likelihood of the militarization of Russia's civilian and commercial vessels, and the facilitation that those vessels can provide to deep sea surveillance and potentially sabotage operations. So the report does identify a steady increase in Russian naval activity around UK waters, as well as other Northern European countries as well. The uptick is marked since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and in particular, like we said, over the last 2 years, that 30% increase is particularly notable. The report itself was triggered really by the announcement from the Ministry of Defence and the Defence Minister in London, Giannangeli, on the 9th of April, that a months-long Russian operation had been taking place in the North Atlantic. We don't really know where specifically, but our understanding is that it was in the location of significant concentrations of both subsea cables and underwater energy pipelines. The operation itself, as I mentioned, was months long, prolonged, sophisticated operation involving not only specialized deep sea capabilities by capabilities overseen by the Russian Main Directorate of Deep Sea Research, GUGI, the dedicated arm of the Russian Ministry of Defense for deep sea seabed warfare, essentially, but also notably an Akula class attack submarine, which was essentially used as a distraction away from the main operation, which was taking place near those critical underwater pieces of infrastructure. Now, we understand from the MOD briefing that no damage was understood to have taken place, no sabotage during the operation. But it has to be said, during the Russian operation, it's pretty clear that the UK Royal Navy, in tandem with allies, particularly the Royal Norwegian Navy, was essentially signaling to the Russians that they were being watched, likely to deter them from conducting any sort of nefarious sabotage, or indeed more overt preparing of the ground, as it were, for future escalations. So essentially, the Russian threat is pretty clear. I think this operation, we don't really get many announcements from NATO governments as to the scale of these sorts of operations that are ongoing. But this is the most recent and clearest example of both capability and will from the Russians to essentially raconteur our most critical vulnerabilities under the sea, and essentially leverage its capability to interfere with these.
One thing that interests me is the issue of plausible deniability. Surely the days have gone now where the severing of a cable, albeit seemingly accidentally or not, can be obviously denied by Russia in an outright fashion. Surely, our eyes are open now, right? So how much do they still rely on this issue of plausible deniability?
They do to varying extents, and I think we've discussed this before, Marco, where the Russian approach to these sorts of hybrid operations are almost two sides of the same coin, in that at the same time they want to rely, and they do rely, on plausible deniability, but they also want key decision makers in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in Washington to understand who is conducting these operations because it informs their wider strategic deterrence campaign. So it's a bit of a, the Russians are sort of trying to have their cake and eat it, as it were. Obviously, operations such as these, the one that was announced in the North Atlantic, there was an attempt to obfuscate the actual operation, which was the Gugi-led operation involving the likely Belgorod modified Oscar II class submarine, which is a specially built mothership for deep sea operations. The Russians clearly want to illustrate these capabilities, but the fact that they were identified, no submariner wants to be discovered, on their mission, quite frankly. So there are limits, of course, but in terms of the plausible deniability of these deep sea operations, of course, the depths that we're talking about, the Gugi specialized submarines can go much deeper than conventional naval submarines. So, even identifying where the Russians are at that depth is very, very difficult. And of course, identifying any damage conducted to infrastructure that far down is difficult to trace at all, but then, of course, repair. That will provide the Russians with an element of plausible deniability, of course. If we can't see them do it, was it them? I think it's pretty safe to conclude, though, that the Russians have amongst the most sophisticated deep sea capability in the world, and that's very much by design. Over many decades, the Soviets invested significantly in this capability. This is not a new thing. This is a decades-long strategic priority for the Kremlin, whoever has sat in the Kremlin.
It's important to note, isn't it, then, in that case, that this isn't just a result of the stance that Britain took over Ukraine. This is part of a long-standing strategic plan.
Absolutely. This is very, very clear. The Soviets, throughout have been very, very clear on their prioritization of seabed warfare, economic warfare as deterrence. It's threatening economic damage is a very clear priority in its doctrine, as well as its sort of deterrence escalation management strategy, particularly if there was to be some sort of Russia-NATO confrontation, and the UK is very important within that. So this is long been the zeitgeist. But when we're talking about plausible deniability and the concerns that I have for where the Russians are likely to move forward, it's the militarization of the shadow fleet and utilization of civilian vessels to supplement the more top-end capabilities that Gugi, for example, can provide. We've already seen, the various private military contractors on Russian vessels with pretty clear links to Russian intelligence. Gugi, again, likely have lots of other vessels which they are in contact with or even directing. So, those are the concerns that I have. And with the proliferation and rapid developments of other maritime capabilities, particularly uncrewed surface vessels, USVs, and unmanned underwater vessels, UUVs, these are capabilities that the Ukrainians and the Russians are developing at pace in the Black Sea. The Russians will be deploying those lessons in other areas, in other waters. And these, it's hundreds and hundreds of shadow fleet vessels that could potentially be de facto, operators of these sorts of, semi-autonomous maritime capabilities. Those could cause a lot of disruption and, again, provide that plausible deniability, which the Russians do want to maintain to an extent.
Thank you, Alex. Chris, hello, and welcome. You are one of the first, or it's not the first, to warn about the threat to undersea cables in your 2014 book, Superhighway, I think. So you were writing about that more than a decade ago. Can you give us an outline of what your concerns were then and whether anyone's listened?
Well, at the time, I was looking at possibilities for the future expansion of warfare at sea, and it included the use of unmanned vehicles by air, on the surface and under the surface. The point I was making is that I thought that the subsea environment, which is very much a stealth environment, of course, because of its conditions, was going to become less opaque as a result of improvements in data and acoustic processing and the use of unmanned underwater vehicles, some with towed arrays, some that will be able to stay on station for months at a time. And in many ways, I still think it's true that that will be the case. And if you look at the proliferation of unmanned vehicles above the surface now, you're going to see that happening below the surface as well. So the biggest problem we're going to have, if you're in submarines now, is the threat of something clanging onto your hull without any sort of expectation at all. And the challenge for all countries now in underwater warfare is to integrate those unmanned and increasingly autonomous vehicles into an ecosystem that has traditional platforms, traditional sensors, within a strategic approach that mirrors the one that we used to have during the Cold War. So we're reinventing lots of wheels here. If you look at the Royal Navy's Atlantic Bastion concept, for example, I'm afraid to say it's a direct crib from what happened during the Cold War. At the time, it wasn't called the Atlantic Bastion, as the only bastions were associated, oddly enough, with Russian SSBN activity. But what we did at the time is we had two concepts. One was containment, which was entirely designed to keep Russian submarines, Soviet submarines at the time, bottled up in the north, and also defense in depth. And a lot of the language that I see being used now is an exact copy of how I was trained as a junior officer, that we would do anti-submarine warfare against the Soviet fleet. So quite a lot of the concepts are not new. That's the point. And the technology it's going to enable us to do a lot more in terms of detection, classification, and also prosecution, if we have to do it, of submarine with a small s activity. Now, the key challenge for the Russians, of course, is to make their underwater vehicles less detectable. You saw a distraction technique, which Alex mentioned just now, by using an Akula. Akula is a big distraction. So is a Yasin, for example. If a Yasin came out into the North Atlantic, you really want to keep a handle on that. Soviet submarines getting quieter, so it's a bit of a struggle too. But I think we're underestimating, even today, the capability, the asymmetric capability offered by GUGI, the Department of Deep Sea Research and Exploration. Some of these submarines are pretty capable. If you look at the Losherick, for example, is a nuclear-powered deep submersion vehicle. That doesn't exist anywhere else. And it replicates some of the things that the Russians are doing in space at the moment. The Antar, with which everybody's familiar, it's public enemy number one around the UK, that deploys these underwater vehicles. And as Alex again mentioned, the Bolgorod, which is an ex-Oscar class, pretty substantial piece of machinery, is deploying all sorts of things. Now, we shouldn't kid ourselves that we're not, on the Allied side, doing the same. You see, I saw the USS Jimmy Carter returning to port 2 years ago with what looked like a Jolly Roger with some symbols on it. It looked very much like seabed activity going on. So we shouldn't kid ourselves that it's just the Soviets doing it. I think we're playing catch up. I think it's taken a long time for NATO in particular and democratic electoral governments to get a grip on this. When I produced Superhighway in 2014, it had a lot of things that were going to happen, I thought, in the next decade. It got a stiff ignoring because the immediate question from politicians and people trying to run budgets and Ministry of Defense was, well, how does this affect voting in the next elections? And manifestly, it didn't. It's now suddenly come to the top of the electoral list. There are votes in defense at the moment.
That might explain why it took till December last year, I think, to launch Atlantic Bastion, even though, as you say, the concept wasn't new. We also have RFA Proteus, don't we? A specialized maritime surveillance vessel which can deploy autonomous submersibles. I'm assuming in a sort of a patrolling capacity. But I mean, is any of this enough?
Well, no, manifestly not. I mean, it's ironic, really, because we had one of these vessels back in the early 2000s. We actually disposed of it because nobody thought there was a threat anymore. And, the other remarkable thing is everybody thinks about sabotage of underwater cables. What we're going to be looking at in future is the ability to clamp onto them and actually extract the data. One of the things that Andrew Snowden very carelessly sort of gave to the world was that the technology exists to be able to clamp onto these cables, see what's going on within them without reducing the amplitude, thereby giving away that it had been penetrated. So we're going to see these cables, I think, in future used for inserting probably mal data for one thing, and also for gaining intelligence in the same way we do with SIGINT and things like that. And this is a factor that I haven't seen mentioned at all. The Russians are not just interested in destroying these cables, they're interested in getting intelligence from them.
I think that's very key. Other things we've done, I believe, and please, Chris or Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, we've increased Poseidon patrols of our maritime surveillance aircraft. I wonder, and we have increased cooperation with our sort of North Sea NATO allies. Now, I don't know the answer to this, but I am wondering whether there is some role, for instance, the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, could play on a more permanent basis. If the issue is we don't have enough maritime hulls in the water, is that an answer? Is that a potential solution?
Now, Marco, what we've got to do, at the risk of repeating myself, is go back to building the strategic ecosystem we had during the Cold War. If a Russian nuclear submarine came off the North Cape, it was tracked continuously, and it was supported by intelligence that submarine would go to sea. We've got to start marking these assets, seeing where they are at any particular time. We've got to have very close surveillance of their base Olenia up in the north. And as soon as one of them moves, we have to say, right, where is it? And we've got to bring to bear a lot of fixed and mobile sensors and arrays deployed from the air, of course, but also by submarines and other platforms, and say, look, we mustn't lose touch with these things. We've got to know where they are at any particular time. And putting constant presence in the water and also pressure on these hulls will mean that their operations will become much more difficult. We've also got to restart, dare I say it, offensive operations up in the Barents and under the ice. We've neglected our ability to go up there and actually put pressure on the Soviets themselves. So their backyard basically has a huge wall around it, not one that they've put there, but we've done it by self-denial. So we've got to get back up there. We've got to generate more hulls. Alex, and you both know right now, we've got one of our Astute class submarines at sea operational. That's disgraceful. During the Cold War, we had anything up to 12 submarines doing exactly the job that we want. We just got to start taking it seriously again. And as I said, if an Akula is loose in the Atlantic, then there's something wrong if we don't know where it is. It's a difficult job. We've got to put the assets in there. Same with the Gugi motherships. Wherever they are, we need to know where they are 24 hours a day. Because the old Lushereks and the Cachalots aren't going to flog all the way down to deal with things in the west of Ireland. There's one more thing, guys, that we need to sort out, and that's the Irish. We've got a huge dead zone in maritime to the west of Ireland. And we've certainly seen Russian submarines recently practicing cruise and hypersonic missile attacks from the west of Ireland. That's a dead space for detection. One of the things I've been urging recently in the House of Lords is that the Irish have got to come on board with helping to sanitize and allow us to survey in their economic zone. 75% of all North Atlantic cables go through Irish territorial seas or economic zone or from Ireland itself. They've got to start taking it seriously. If they don't want to do it themselves, they've got to call in their EU and NATO buddies to help.
Well, Ireland has, of course, pressed the trigger on 12 new maritime patrol ships, but it'll be some time before they're online, which is always the problem. Alex, why don't we finish off by you reminding us of what's at stake? So there are potentially 2 times where a major strike could be deployed. For instance, one, when there's already the shadow of conflict, and 2, before that. So in the case that Russia, launches an equivalent of a Pearl Harbor on Britain by cutting its cables, by making us totally in the dark when it comes to internet access and things like that. Just tell us, what is the effect of that? How will it hit us?
Yeah, so the UK is particularly vulnerable to this sort of capability. We are an island nation. We have always been reliant on maritime supply chains and the secure maritime environments. But given the limited hulls that we have with the Royal Navy, and the wider sort of drawing down of, as Chris mentioned, that sort of Cold War era strategic system, that does provide opportunities for adversaries to take advantage of at a critical moment of global crisis. The Russians are almost certainly, a large part of what they are currently doing and what they were likely doing in the North Atlantic, announced by the defense minister, defense secretary, is tracking the vulnerabilities, identifying where the critical points are, potentially setting conditions with there's concerns of pre-setting, charges, etc. But also, setting conditions for potential attacks and escalation should the Kremlin wish. The broad sweep of the Russian system and the hybrid campaign that they're launching is broadly, I think, in my assessment, characterized by providing options to the boss. You want to provide as many options to Putin as possible for him to then choose at his given time of choice when to push which button, basically. Now, there are concerns below that overly enthusiastic GRU, Googie, naval officers, intelligence officers, etc., may well go beyond that and start to think, well, I think the boss would want this, so I'm going to do that. There's quite a lot of autonomy within the Russian system to do such as this, and we're seeing that on the continent of Europe at the moment with the Russian Grey Zone campaign, which we're tracking daily. But in terms of the impact on the UK, so I think this does come back to the Russian escalation management strategy. And we've looked at various scenarios as to how the Russians would attack the UK and other NATO allies, or indeed Ireland, and what situation we would require to get to that. If there was to be some sort of major global crisis moment, perhaps over Ukraine, perhaps in a few years' time over the Baltics, there's various scenarios which we've wargamed and planned out. The Russians may well be in a position to try and deter a coherent and committed UK commitment to the continent, and inflicting economic pain on the UK is within the maritime doctrine, very, very clear. Within the wider, hybrid doctrines that we're tracking and trying to understand, it's pretty clear that the Russians do view this as part of a clear deterrence campaign to try and inflict damage early, to try and prevent decision makers from responding effectively to any Russian aggression in the east, for example, or an ambiguous situation. They want to try and prevent the UK from doing that. So our maritime infrastructure, because of the plausible deniability also, if there was to be a major outage, for example, the onus is perhaps on us to prove that the Russians did it. But that's precisely why they would want to go down that road, perhaps. And I think at that point, this is where the difficulty comes. If the Russians may well want to present a very complicated, confused situation, doesn't want to present a very clear-cut case, which necessitates an easy response. This is the nature of the hybrid war. It wants to create confusion and uncertainty. And at that point, well, what does the UK government do? That is a realistic scenario, I think, short of, a much more, direct, kinetic confrontation. But we do look at these sorts of scenarios in depth. And there are various scenarios where the Russians could well utilize these sorts of capabilities.
I think it's worth remembering that Britain pioneered the concept of actually cutting people's cables. At the start of the First World War, we actually had a specialist vessel called the Alert, and it promptly cut the 5 cables that Germany had in Europe, separating it from all its sort of potential allies and some of the neutral countries as well. And we then manipulated that, of course, by forcing them into communications that we could intercept. So I think that's something we've got to bear in mind, that if our cables are lost, we're going to have to find other means, either through space or through terrestrial communications, to be able to supplement. Those are interceptable, of course. We know the Russians are looking at destroying or jamming satellites in space. So again, we've got to think of this in strategic terms, not just in operational and tactical terms in the North Atlantic.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Admiral Chris Parry, and you, Alex Lord, for joining me today. And I'd like to thank our viewers too for tuning in, and I hope you found it as interesting as I did. Until next week, goodbye.